Hi, everyone. Our next conversation is with Emily Galvin-Almanza. Welcome, Emily. Emily, you're on mute. Oh, there you are. You're back on. I'm going to introduce Maurice, who will be our discussant. Maurice, over to you.
Thanks. Emily, it's great to see you. I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction because Emily has worn a number of hats, and they're all very interesting. She's here today with an organization that she founded called Partners for Justice, and I'm going to let her explain this really innovative program. But in the past, she's been a public defender in Los Angeles County, in Santa Clara County, Bronx Defenders. And she was one of the first attorneys on the Three Strikes project at Stanford. So you must have worked with Larry Marshall at some point, who's a longtime friend of mine from Chicago. You had a policy position at the Justice Collaboration, and you had a media role at the Appeal. And so you are in a sort of a unique position to talk about issues that from perhaps how the media can write with more nuance or sophistication about some of these issues. And I guess really you're at a kind of an interesting juncture, you might say. So I wonder if you could start by talking to us about what exactly is Partners for Justice. How did it come to be, and how do you envision it continuing to roll out?
Oh gosh, well, thank you for that question. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having me. So Partners for Justice is an attempt to transform public defense in America as a system. It's not really a system. It's a set of agencies dispersed across 3,142 counties and the District of Columbia. Some are state agencies, some are county agencies, some jurisdictions have both. But by and large, what we're trying to do is redefine what we mean when we say public defender and help public defenders everywhere convert themselves to match that definition. So what is the definition? When I was a defender, as you mentioned, I've been a defender in a couple different states now and in a few different, contexts. And I don't like the idea of defending a case. I want to defend a person. After all, that's the way that people of wealth and privilege are defended in this country, right? If you are a wealthy business person and you are accused of a crime, you've got your criminal defense lawyer, but you also have your business lawyer making sure this doesn't affect, your income, your employment, your employability. You might have someone working on business licensure or your personal licenses that you hold. You might have someone ensuring this doesn't have any impact on your housing. Maybe you've got a mortgage pending and you want to make sure it doesn't impact that. Maybe your children are implicated and you want to make sure you don't have any custody problems or that their future schooling or ability to get educational loans isn't impacted. The point is, when people of privilege engage our criminal legal system, they do so with essentially a wraparound interdisciplinary team that defends them as a person, their life, their challenges, their goals, and also ensures that their story is told in a way that forces our criminal legal infrastructure, which can be very dehumanizing, to see that person as a human being with potential. But of course, we all know the reality is that 80% of the people in our criminal legal system are public defender clients, most of whom are Black and brown, all of whom are low income, historically excluded and disempowered deliberately by our criminal legal infrastructure. So what I'm trying to do is build public defender augmentation that can provide that kind of wraparound interdisciplinary team work in any defender agency, even if they're not, Bronx Defenders holistic model of practice. If they're just starting out their journey towards collaborative practice, we can help them provide that kind of service to their clients, eliminate days and actually at this point years in jail. We've eliminated 180 years in jail. We've connected over 4,000 people with social services. Most of the time we do this by embedding non-lawyers, brilliant new professionals who work on housing, employment, employability, education, benefits, access to substance use, mental health, medical treatment, licensure, family unity, vital document gathering. I mean, we work on everything, and we embed them with public defenders around the country. We're also now starting to do capacity building work with defenders who might want to build that out themselves, who don't need an embedded team, but might want to, repurpose their own staff to do that. The cool thing about it is that, one, it gets better results in terms of eliminating jail days, helping people stabilize, helping people be seen as a human with potential and important things to provide and give to this world. But it's also just like really sensible, because all the research on crime shows that things like housing stability, access to mental health, medical and substance use care, meaningful work, like these are all things that diminish engagement in criminal harm. So when we provide them in like a really easy to access one-stop shop where people are going anyway for services, i.e. the public defender, we are making our communities safer. The public defender is in fact an important piece of public safety infrastructure. So that's what we're doing. We're redefining the public defender as a safety resource.
How do you make these connections? Are people starting to learn about what you're doing and reaching out to you? And do they say, well, how much is this going to cost me? Or, it's a kind of a nuts and bolts question that I've been thinking about, because it just makes so much sense.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a thing that should already have existed. That was my first year of doing this. I was like, who is already out there? This should totally already exist. It's really not groundbreaking. It's just common sense. So defenders around the country have heard about us through, their professional associations, through peer defenders, through me yelling about things on Twitter. It's been kind of a large outreach journey. We're presenting at NACDL shortly, and I'm publishing a paper this year on the racial justice case for expanded public defense. So they're hearing about us through a number of ways. Ideally, we're not taking dollars out of a public defender's budget. What I mean by that is, for a local government, this kind of investment in their defender is a really good investment. They are literally purchasing stronger community safety programs, better social service access, lower utilization of jails, all of these things that are like good for safety and economic mobility and save money. So for a local government, this is a really good buy. And I've been partnering with defenders to actually go to their county councils, county board of supervisors, sometimes state, governors, agencies, and seek the additional funding for them to do this, so that they're not trying to cut any dollars out of their budget. They are getting more dollars into their budget to do this work.
So you're in a position from the defense sort of side of things to see how certain narratives drive when we talk about crime statistics, and we talk about repeat offenders, and we talk about being tough sort of on crime. And I'm wondering what kind of perspective you can offer to journalists from your side of the fence, because face it, particularly public defenders, they're largely, if not instructed, certainly it's part of the package is you don't talk to the press.
Can go sideways on you really fast. You make that statement that you think is a really good statement on day 4 of your case, and on day 16, you realize the facts are other than you thought. That, yeah, no, it's no good. So it's hard because police departments have dedicated enormous amounts of money to communications. There's, of course, as we all in this room probably know, a long history of police granting access to the press in a way that creates a mutually beneficial relationship. Police narratives are out there in the press, and the press get access to details that they might not otherwise have been able to attain about, a high profile case or a case of interest. The problem with that information imbalance is that you can't rely on the information from one side of the system in a vacuum. That's why we have the term propaganda. we have at this point some very well-developed communication structures on that side of the equation that have a policy agenda and that are pushing often that policy agenda through descriptions of crime rates, descriptions of what people should and need to be afraid of, often sort of fear-mongering tactics designed to inspire public panic in a way that creates greater police or prosecutorial funding. I think defenders are often, defenders are working hard to be better and more comfortable at engaging with media, and I think some are doing it brilliantly. I also think it's important to remember that there's a lot of factors that go into why a defender might not want to talk to a reporter. One is that we are often representing people who are already so disempowered by this system and undergoing an experience that may be the worst experience of their life, and do not necessarily want to be even more in the media or take any risks with their case. I think that public defenders are correctly as cautious as possible. I mean, a good defender is treating their client the way they would want their loved one to be treated in the system, protected with that level of care and sometimes paranoia. So I think on individual cases, the calculus of whether to comment is really complicated. That being said, defenders are getting better at talking about the macro stuff and unpacking some really important realities that get neglected from the conversation. So for example, let's take, for example, the current conversation we're having about crime. Is crime rising? Is crime not rising? There are opinion polls where people say their opinion is that crime is rising. And I'm like, in what other field do we poll people on their opinion of what the facts are? There are facts and there are opinions. And your opinion of the facts is not a media concern. So, looking at things to say, okay, in these specific jurisdictions, these specific crimes are up, these specific crimes are down. What can that tell us about what people are experiencing? I read something really interesting the other day about the link between increased gun sales in the wake of January 6th and increased gun possession arrests thereafter. It makes perfect sense. But if you adopt a sort of simplistic crime is rising because these arrests are up narrative, you might miss the nuance of what societal factors may be in play here in driving human behavior. I will say, I've represented thousands of people. I don't think I've ever represented someone who engaged in harm for no reason. Almost always when there is a type of harm that's creating a pattern, there's a type of social undercurrent that has interplay with that. Confinement, lack of access to medical or mental health care, job loss, economic insecurity, rising inflation, increased gun sales due to January 6th things, increasing polarization in communities. All of these are issues that so often get left out of the conversation. You see crime reporting that's just about crime and not talking about eviction rates in that jurisdiction, or not necessarily talking about job loss rates, or in which communities we're seeing this sort of thing happen. Is it a community under a great deal of economic stress, educational disruption due to the pandemic and kids not being able to go to school? I mean, I think that it's a missed opportunity to talk about all of the factors we know underlie engagement in crime. And the other reason that's a big loss is criminal legal policy in this country is so often shaped by emotion, right? Like, we make policy decisions based on who people are afraid of and who they're mad at. I saw this recently with the fentanyl conversation where people were saying, well, fentanyl should have a harsher punishment than heroin. It's like, if you're going to punish guys out there on the street who are selling a bag and they're not the guys actually packing the bag, and they're not also calculating in their head what the sentencing will be if they are caught for that particular baggie versus this particular baggie, you're not actually engaging in a policy that's likely to diminish harm. A policy that's likely to diminish harm is likely a healthcare oriented or a harm reduction policy in the drug space. But because we make these decisions based on who we're afraid of and who we're mad at, we get policy that's hyper emotional and not hyper logical. And anytime journalists can engage the well-researched body of evidence on what actually causes crime, again, housing instability, lack of access to care, lack of access to employment or the ability to feed your family, the more we can sort of educate the public on the fact that the crime conversation should not be about who you're afraid of and who you're mad at. It shouldn't be about your feelings on a particular type of event. I really hate DUIs. That should be a minimum 10-year sentence because DUIs make me mad. No, it should be a conversation of what actually makes this harm less likely to happen in the future. Does increased access to substance use treatment or increased, low cost access to substance use treatment care and mental health care actually diminish this type of offense? Probably much more so than an increased penalty for that offense. Increased penalties don't tend to be deterrent. Access to care in the vast body of harm that is substance or mental health oriented does diminish wrongdoing. So I think journalists have a role to play in that education.
It seems to me, and you can push back on me on this, but with the vast amount of defense work that's done in this country by public defenders, who I think are some of the most hardworking, great, and overworked, underfunded, under-resourced attorneys in this country, that they really could drive a lot of the narrative about how to change, how to reform the system in a way that, we've talked a lot over the last day and a half about a lot of the problems you mentioned, but particularly how we punish people in this country. And most of the punishment that's doled out is doled out in cases handled by public defenders. So they're really right at the vortex of being in a position to perhaps contribute to the narrative of how we're over sentencing, or we're, creating this massive number of people with criminal records. And I'm wondering how you would perceive, Partners for Justice and through your work with the public defenders to try and create a narrative that perhaps is more along that line.
We're trying. So you're right. I think, you've heard Glenn Martin say that the people closest to the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but farthest from resources, which is absolutely true. In the criminal defense context, the people closest to the problem are not at liberty to speak because they are in great jeopardy if they do so with an open criminal matter. The statements of an accused person can be used against them in a very real way, even, if misinterpreted. So defenders are like the people second closest to the problem, but most at liberty to speak if they are trained to and choose to do so. More and more offices are bringing in public-facing communications capacity, which I think is brilliant and wonderful. And I'm excited that you can call many defender agencies these days and get someone on the phone who can give you a quote or help you understand an issue or walk you through what's happening in a policy zone. It's amazing. If you can't reach them, you can call me. But I think that in the PFJ context, what's great about our work is we're all over the country. We're going to be in 20 locations by July. We are touching on so many different bodies of subject matter. Criminal law, yes, but all of those other fields that I mentioned before, which are so often related to the drivers of criminal system involvement and also the consequences, the sort of, I hate the term collateral consequences, but the enmeshed penalties of criminal system involvement. So we can take a really nice holistic view of what a person is experiencing, the fallout they're experiencing, what our criminal legal policies are doing in other zones. And I think that's really important. Most recently, I've been trying to inspire our advocate corps themselves, who are largely new professionals, many of whom have personal system impact in their own families, to write about what they're seeing and to offer those perspectives and to be, because they have such a ground, like a client level perspective on, oh, hey, there's this great program, but nobody can afford access to it because it's $25 a class and no one can afford $25 a class for a minimum 12 classes. Or, it costs $300 a day to get an ankle monitor. No one's going to be able to do that. It's not achieving its purpose. Or, hey, in this particular region, there are no inpatient substance use programs for monolingual Spanish speakers in this region of California. They're seeing these problems that are incredibly important and underaddressed. So we are working hard in-house to develop more ability to have our advocates help clients be heard. I don't like this idea of clients being voiceless, but in truth, our system is oppressive and designed to silence people accused within it. So we are trying to alleviate that, push back on that, and also share the things that we're learning.
20 cities.
Over 20, I think 21.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I would think that these people would have incredible stories to tell, and I'm wondering if journalists reached out, whether they could, you talk about the police department providing sort of this access, and within the constraints, I understand, pending cases and all of that, but certainly talking about issues that it doesn't have to be necessarily driven by a name-specific anecdote, although that's always helpful. And my guess is that there are people that would come through who they have a success story that, if not for this, where would I be, kind of thing. I mean, we see this with bail reform and what bail reform can do and how it can save jobs and save, instead of locking people up. It would seem like your folks would have some great stories to tell.
Absolutely. And once in a while, we've had that opportunity to have clients share their perspectives. It's been incredibly rewarding. And yeah, one of the nice things about being in so many locations is even when we can't be a direct source, we can often be a conduit. We can say, oh, you're working on, you want to know about what's happening with, I'm going to make something up, bail reform in Lawrence, Kansas. I know the right person. I don't yet have that information myself, but I know the right person, or our advocate teams know the right person. This is because we work with so many different community groups in order to make service acquisition really seamless for our clients. We're often collaborating with a number of providers in the community. So advocates have touch points at 12 or 15 or 20 different agencies in their locality, which is nice because it gives us a greater diversity of views and angles and perspectives on what's happening in that region.
And so what has the feedback been from actual public defenders who, these are the people in the trenches who now are, I don't know what the right word is. They're not relieved of certain things, responsibilities. Well, yeah, they probably
they actually should be. So if you're a great public defender, you've been trying really hard to do this stuff yourself. Because when your client looks you in the eye and says, hey, I know you want to talk about this like suppression thing you're working on, but my number one concern is that I missed 3 shifts at work for the last 3 court dates, and I'm going to lose my job if I miss another shift. You as a good defender want to drop the suppression motion and be like, yeah, let me call your boss. I'll explain why you have to be here. I take that on. So when we bring in a team that takes on the life navigation, the lawyer can both focus on the legal work, which is great. That's where we want their skill set. And they have a chance to get much better outcomes. Here's why. As a public defender, you are very accustomed to being metaphorically punched in the face every day. We fight hard and we lose a lot. There's a lot of structural reasons for that, which I could talk your ear off about, but I will not do that to you. But the thing is, when you've got someone on your team who's a service specialist who can help your client overcome a number of challenges that may be driving their system involvement and help your client achieve some really cool successes, you as the lawyer have had to do none of the legwork. You just get to go back to the judge and say, hey, judge, you know how you were worried about where my client was going to live and, her work situation and her medical stabilization, mental health services. Well, let me tell you about all the things that she's done together with this advocate on my team. And let me tell you why this would be a totally inappropriate case for jail because my client is doing so well in the community. So lawyers get to offload the non-legal work and get more wins and make stronger cases and have better relationships with their clients because they are actually being client-led and following their clients' goals across subject matter. So on the whole, I'm hoping that this will actually reduce burnout a lot in addition to improving outcomes for individual attorneys.
Steve, I see your sense that you're raising your hand.
Yes, and I haven't raised my hand actually, but I have a question. So before Emily, before Partners for Justice, there was a kind of movement. I'm not sure if I can call it a movement, but where prosecutors and public defenders together formed a kind of team in individual communities to do exactly what you're doing now. I'm thinking Milwaukee, for instance, is the biggest example and best and most successful example. And which means basically within the system, you no longer had that sort of adversarial relationship. It was a major rethink of how we treated a lot of these issues. And I'm wondering whether this replaces that, your idea replaces that, or in some ways, or adds to it. That's my phone.
That's a great question, and that's a beautiful ringtone.
Yes, it is.
Look, I am more than happy to collaborate with any prosecutor who prioritizes liberation and equity and success for my clients, who looks at a problem in the community and doesn't say, how do we punish this, but says, how do we fix this? I'm down. The problem is almost every prosecutor's job description is to try to put my client in a cage. And it's very hard to collaborate with somebody who wants to take your client away from their family and lock them in a cage. So when it comes to being a community defender, fighting for community members, I mean, ask your client, do they want you collaborating with the prosecutor? Most of them don't. Most of the time when I'm in court and I'm going to go talk to a prosecutor and be collegial, I have to say to my client, hey, you're going to see me talking to that guy and I'm going to be polite because I want to get you a good outcome. But that doesn't mean I'm on his side. That doesn't mean I'm on, I think that trust has to be earned with mutual investment in the restoration and empowerment of community members. And any prosecutor who wants to do that is on my team. Anybody who wants to eliminate the necessity for carceral punishment is on my team. But I think that the reality on the ground is that jurisdictions like that are at this point few and far between. And that in most places, we have set up an adversarial system where prosecutors are being incentivized in their office to get jail time. They're being promoted based on winning convictions and getting jail time. And I think as long as you have incentives set up that way for one side of the system, it's very, very hard to rely on that side of the system to be deeply invested in restoration. I do think that if prosecutors were re-incentivized to come up with the most restorative solutions possible, the most pro-safety, the most pro-opportunity, if people were being promoted because they came up with a genius course of action to help a person succeed, not being promoted because they put that person in jail, I think we would see a radical sea change in the way criminal law is practiced and the outcomes for public safety.
Thank you.
Let's say that a journalist comes to you and says, I'd like to embed myself with some of your folks. Is that something that, I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm thinking as a journalist now,
Yeah.
What would you tell them?
Well, I'd be open to talking about it. I think that my number one concern is always my client. If you were having the worst day of your life where you got arrested for something really scary or embarrassing, and you went to see your trusted legal counsel and they said, hey, I have a journalist here who's going to listen in on our conversation and not reveal your identity. I think they would feel differently to different clients. I think there are actually some people in that context who would really be excited to have their story told and want to speak out about what they're experiencing in the system. And to the extent that we are honoring our clients' desire to speak out and be heard, all for it. As long as we are working in service of the goals of our clients, I am all for it. Yeah.
I do think that there's a natural reticence, just because the past is this, the door is closed. There is a question in the question box that talks about, it's a case that I just was reading about. Twake Lake spent 6 years in a Mississippi jail for a crime he didn't commit. He was represented initially when he was arrested, but then he sat another 2 years without any legal representation before he was indicted. And really the question is, what can be done about this? Really, it's a dead zone in a place like Mississippi that doesn't have a statewide public defender system.
Yeah. We talk a lot about accountability on the police and prosecution side, right? Because qualified immunity is such a thing that's really influencing the culture, a culture that develops without accountability. to me, a situation like that is one that calls for accountability on the part of legal system stakeholders who allowed that to happen to that person. Who was the judge who let that happen? Who was the lawyer? So my thinking on it is institutional defense creates a locus of accountability that is really, really helpful. It also creates shared resources, shared minimal practice standards, shared culture, shared capabilities, shared training. So I think that there are vast regions of this country that are not served by public defenders. They have, an appointment system where a great lawyer may be appointed, or a lawyer who's not invested or burned out or experiencing some other harm in their life that's making it hard for them to be a good lawyer might be appointed. And it's just the luck of the draw.
Right.
The thing about an institutional defender is, by and large, the minimum practice standards of working in an institution where people have like performance reviews and, like KPIs and all of the benefits of an organized, centralized locus of service, all of that is lost when you don't have an institutional defender. So I think it is frankly appalling that we do not have institutional defense in every single region of this country. I think that everybody in America should have access, not just to an institutional defender, but one with the wraparound service capacity to approximate the kind of defense people of privilege get. That is so far from most, sort of looser panel systems. And the result of that, the weaker public defense is, the more race and poverty determine legal outcomes, which should be appalling to anyone who hears me say that. The idea that we live in a country where race and poverty determine the outcome of a legal matter. Right. So if we want to make sure that we live in a country where that doesn't happen, where race and wealth no longer determine legal outcomes, we need stronger and institutional defense.
Well, here. I couldn't agree more. And we're out of time, unfortunately. That went by in a nano. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I really appreciate what Partners for Justice is doing. I think it's terrific, and keep expanding.
Thank you so much. I'll do my best. Thanks
right.
for having me, y'all.
Let me echo that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Take care.
And we'll take a 15-minute break this time before we get into our next session and our last session of the day on the reform landscape in the states. Thank you very much.